Good morning, everyone. I'm Millicent Critchfield, and this summer I researched modern tourism, specifically current sustainability efforts and the general ethicality of it. And before I begin, I just kind of want to provide a working definition of the word sustainability. We see it all the time in the media, but a lot of people don't actually know what it means. It's really quite simple. It's just a way of existing in society and living while conserving your use of resources so we can continue to live this way for generations. And I'd like to go through a brief history of tourism. So for as long as people have existed, we've been moving around, mostly due to weather patterns and looking for food. The earliest recorded long-distance travel was from Africa to Eurasia about 60,000 years ago. But of course, these people weren't traveling because they wanted to experience a new culture or a new landscape. They were traveling out of necessity. The first known people that traveled for fun, for pleasure, engaging in what we know as tourism, were the ancient Romans. So during the summer, the wealthy Romans would travel from the city to the seaside to stay in villas to escape the heat. And even for the wealthiest of Romans, it was very, very difficult. It took a lot of time, and it was definitely very dangerous because of how little was known about traveling. But still, this is really, really significant in the history of tourism because this is the first instance of people actually engaging in it. And then one more really significant landmark in the history of tourism is something known as the Grand Tour. So this took place from about the 1600s to the 1800s in Western Europe, where young aristocratic men would travel around and visit cities to learn about culture and history. And it usually either revolved around or ended up in Rome. So again, Rome is kind of the center of this. And this is an image of a painting of Lord George Byron, who is an English poet, and he's here on his grand tour admiring the Colosseum in Rome. And like it did for many aspects of life, the Industrial Revolution had a really significant impact on the tourism industry. So starting with the rise of the train systems, by the late 1800s, they were really prevalent, so people could hop on trains for the day just to experience something new, to engage in tourism, instead of traveling for necessity. So this was kind of the beginning of tourism being accessible to more than just the most wealthy people. And then arguably the most significant invention in the tourism industry would be the automobile. So by the early 1900s, 1920s, it was really, really prevalent in society thanks to the work of people like Henry Ford. This is an image of the Ford Model T, which absolutely revolutionized the industry. And the car was really, really important and really special and different because for the first time, people could go wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted. And this is what kind of brought tourism to popularity, got people really excited about it and really involved in it. And then also around this time, you see the beginning of the aviation industry. So in 1903, Orville and Wilbur Wright took off from Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. And while they may have not actually been the first people to fly a plane, they were undeniably pioneers of the industry. And then almost every single year after that, the industry saw really significant improvements. And by the middle of the century, the aviation industry really closely resembled what it looks like today. So, we have like major airlines and then with all of these inventions, there's a lot of money coming into tourism, and it really turns into like a business. So we have these big airlines like Delta, United, we have tourists like tour guides, tour agencies, we have hotel chains. And because there's so much money coming into it, it's continuing to grow, and more people are engaging in tourism and getting involved with it. So from that point on, tourism continued to grow and expand and become more popular every year until we got to today. And recently, something that had a massive, massive impact on the tourism industry was the COVID-19 pandemic. So it started by completely halting tourism. Almost nobody was traveling in the spring of 2020. And this was really harmful for people and economies that rely on tourism for their livelihood. However, there were also some benefits to this, mostly environmentally. This is a graph of daily global carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuels. And you can see over the last 60 years, it was really steadily increasing, and then this really abrupt drop is because of the pandemic. And of course, it's not realistic to think that we could continue to decline so much post-pandemic with things returning to normal. But I think it's really it can be optimistic. We can think if we're more conscious about how we're using fossil fuels, how we're engaging in tourism, and how we're traveling around, we could make a significant difference on the environment. So after COVID caused a massive decline in the tourism industry, it caused a huge, huge boom. We all remember the massive lines at airports. This is Denver International Airport. And there were so many tourists because there was so much pent-up demand from the pandemic, because not only had people not been able to travel, they had saved up flight credits, but they also were saving money over the pandemic so that they could travel when it was back. And by the summer of 2022, people didn't stop traveling. We still had road trips and domestic travel, but by 2022, international travel was back, and tourism was not only back to its pre-pandemic levels, but it was actually far exceeding them. And because there were so many people traveling at once, there's a lot of pressure on the industry, which leads us to the repercussions of tourism. And first, I just want to mention the travel boom isn't only because of COVID. A lot of it also has to do with the shift in values in society and generational differences. So like millennials really care about traveling, and they're also the social media generation, and social media has had a massive, massive impact on tourism, both positively and negatively. So positively, it's really brought people together. It's helped people see places that they wouldn't otherwise get to see, experience new cultures, try new restaurants, stay at different hotels. So it's been really beneficial. But it's also had a lot of negative impacts. One of them being that social media has kind of turned tourism from something that people are doing because they feel they'll really benefit from it spiritually into something that's kind of like a status symbol. People are traveling to post it on social media to show it off. Travel Pulse, which is a travel company, did a survey where they found that 97% of millennials use social media while they're traveling, and actually 1/5 of millennials said that the primary reason that they choose to travel is so they can post about it on social media, which is rather alarming. And then another issue that we see a lot with social media is due to something called geotagging, where you can place your exact location on photos. And this is really increasing foot traffic in areas that used to be limited to word of mouth by locals. And this can be good because it's introducing people to really, really cool new places that they wouldn't otherwise see. But also, it's bringing in so many people that, especially in natural places that aren't used to so much foot traffic, can be really harmful, especially because tourists and visitors usually don't have the same respect and regard for the land as locals. So that has also been harmful. And the excessive crowding isn't just an issue in natural places, it's also an issue in places like Rome, big cities that are used to a lot of tourists. This is a picture of the Trevi Fountain in Rome, which receives 1,200 visitors an hour. And it's also estimated that that fountain right there brings in $1.7 million a year just from people throwing coins into it. And then, of course, these tourists are they're getting their gelato at places nearby, they're staying in local hotels, they're really stimulating the economy. And this sounds like a really great thing, and it is. It's great for the economy. However, because there are so many people, it really allows for a lot of issues to arise, one of the main ones being the exploitation of workers. Because there are so many people coming to stay in these popular tourist destinations and so few people working in the industry, they're being stretched very thin, they're being overworked, underpaid, and it's just exploited in general, and it's a really, really hard environment for them to work in because it's so easy for travel companies to take advantage of their workers. Additionally, in places like Rome that are such popular tourist destinations, we see something known as cultural erosion, where essentially these places kind of change. They provide a different version, an inauthentic version of their culture to accommodate for these expectations that the tourists are bringing with them when they come visit. And this, of course, is really harmful because not only is it providing them with a false reality, but it's also changing the culture in these places. And then finally, currently almost the entire world is experiencing a housing crisis, and the tourism industry contributes significantly to this, both with hotel chains, taking up a lot of space and forcing people out of places, gentrification because of tourism. And also the short-term rental market is really contributing to the housing crisis. Companies like Airbnb, so people will buy these houses in places that they don't live, and then they convert them into a short-term rental. And this not only it raises property values and property taxes, but it also just raises the cost of living in general. And it's taking houses off the market from people that are native to this place. So people that have lived in an area for generations and generations, they're being forced out, which is really sad, and it's something that we need to, fight against. So I know I just gave you all of the downsides to travel, but travel is a really, really great thing. It's really beneficial for society, and it's something that we want to continue. So now let's talk about a few things to preserve travel for years to come. Obviously, if you're engaging in tourism, the first step is choosing your destination. And the two examples I'm about to give are absolute extremes, and I know that most tourists would never go to these places. But sometimes I think by looking at the extremes, it really helps us to see the bigger picture. So the first really debated and controversial tourist destination is Mount Everest. But I think Mount Everest is a really great example of this tourism paradox, right? Because the Nepalese government, who's in charge of giving out the permits to prospective climbers and deciding how many people get to climb the mountain a year, they are bringing in so much money by giving out these permits, and then also a lot of the local economy relies so heavily on tourism to keep them afloat, to provide them with their livelihood, to give them jobs. However, not only is the mountain being destroyed, climbers are leaving a lot of trash behind, global warming is definitely a major concern, but also the Sherpas, the people that guide the climbers up the mountain, they're dying because they're accommodating for so many inexperienced climbers, and there are massive, massive lines to some of the tallest mountain in the world, which is wild. So I think it's a really prime example of how it can benefit a place economically, but at what cost, And then the other destination that I'm going to talk about is a place that's received a lot of popularity, kind of like a staggering amount of popularity recently, and that's Antarctica. So last winter here, so summer there, the continent received 100,000 visitors, which is absolutely wild considering it was only officially discovered 200 years ago, and people didn't even start going there at all until 100 years ago. And a lot of this is due to social media. It's become really, really popular in social media. And this is a really, really controversial destination. There are a lot of safety and ethical concerns. So the safety concerns being that Antarctica the weather is so extreme and it's so remote, and the only way to access it right now for tourists is by cruise ship. And so they have to cross really dangerous waters, brave really hard conditions. And actually in 2014, a cruise ship sank, and all of the crew and passengers had to be rescued, and they actually all survived. But there was a really massive oil spill, and the effects of that are still being seen today, so people are really upset about that. And then there are a lot of ethical concerns because, Antarctica is really unique in the sense that compared to every other place in the world, it doesn't have a government that controls tourism there. There is something called the Antarctic Treaty that regulates all human activity, and it's made up of a lot of countries around the world. But the people that are actually in charge of controlling day-to-day tourism are the tour companies themselves, so I'm sure you can see the conflict of interest here. And Antarctica also doesn't have an indigenous or permanent population. It's just scientists and then these tourists that are there right now. And it kind of raises the question of, should people be allowed to visit there at all? Should even scientists be allowed to visit there? Because it's so beneficial for science to see what a place without human population looks like. And also, a tourist bringing in the smallest bit of contamination, one seed, could totally change the ecosystem and be very, very harmful. And also I want to mention, just if you go to one of these places, that doesn't make you a bad person. These tourists, the ones on the cruise ship, in the hot tub, they're not bad people, and a lot of this is done out of ignorance. They don't realize that this is really harmful. But it's more of a systemic thing that we need to change instead of an individual thing, but we still need to take responsibility as individuals. And then beyond just the destinations themselves, there are other places where you can cut back on your impact, your carbon footprint. So one of them being the way that you actually get there, your mode of transportation. The most harmful way to travel is actually by cruise ship and then followed by airplane. But you can still travel in both of these ways. You can still do both of these and cut back in other ways. The most important thing is that you do as many small things as you can, because that's what adds up over time. So some of those small things can be just anything that you would do at home, reusing a water bottle, turning off the water when you're brushing your teeth, cutting back on single-use plastic. Also, with your accommodations, like I mentioned earlier, the Airbnb crisis, if you can avoid short-term rentals, that's really ideal for having less of an impact on the local community. And then also always try to support local businesses, buy souvenirs from locally owned shops, eat at locally owned restaurants. That goes a long way to support the people there. And then it's really important to be knowledgeable about the tipping culture in the place that you're visiting. So in some countries, a lot of countries in Asia, it's actually considered really rude to tip, so definitely you don't want to be doing that there, but in places like the Americas, it's very customary. And like I mentioned earlier, the tourism industry, it's very, very easy for these people to be exploited, so it's important that we do our part to help them out. And a lot of people in the Americas rely so heavily on gratuity as a really significant portion of their income. So by tipping your people in the service industry, it's going to make a big impact in their lives, and that's really important. And then the last aspect of sustainability that I wanted to touch on is an organization called Leave No Trace. So this organization was founded in the 1990s, but it's been around for a very, very long time, the ideals. I'm not going to read them out, but I have listed the 7 steps. It's just kind of a way to recreate. It's a guideline for recreating in the natural world while minimizing your impact. And just one thing that I wanted to touch on that I've noticed a lot in society is that there's kind of like this misconception that if something came from the earth originally, if it's natural, it can't be litter, which isn't true. You know, you'll see people throwing apple cores out of their window or leaving their banana peels on the beach and they're like, oh, like it came from the earth, it's not litter, it's fine, it'll decompose. But if something isn't native to an area, there's either no mechanism for it to decompose at all or will take a very long time, but either way, it will have a significant impact on the ecosystem. So it's really important to take everything with you. There's a little saying that I like called that goes like, if it doesn't grow here, it doesn't go here. So if it didn't come from that place, don't leave it there. And then just for some final thoughts, you know, tourism is really, really beneficial. It has long brought people together all over the world. It's a great educational opportunity, and it's really good for us as a society. So it's something that we want to continue for a long time. I wanted to talk about, so back to the thing with Antarctica and Mount Everest, there's a famous British climber, his name is George Mallory, and he was famously quoted saying, an interviewer asked him why he wanted to climb Mount Everest, and he just said, because it's there. And people have kind of turned this into like an inspirational quote, which I think is quite ironic considering that very mountain cost him his life not long after he said that. But it's also kind of like a reflection of society. We've developed this attitude, like kind of a sense of entitlement that because something exists on the planet, we're entitled to go see it, we're entitled to go visit it, which I personally don't think is true, and I think as a society we really need to reevaluate that approach. So like I call it the because it's there mentality. It's something that we really need to get rid of. And also like a really important thing to consider just generally is we don't want a few people living a perfectly sustainable zero waste lifestyle. Ideally we want as many people as possible making as many small changes as possible, whether it's using a reusable water bottle, eating less meat, cutting back on single-use plastic. That's what's going to add up in the long term. That's what's going to make the biggest difference. And I think that the most important thing to remember is that we as humans should never let what we want eclipse what the planet needs. And we only have one Earth, so we have to do everything we can to protect it. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to open this up to the questions from the panel, please.
Go first. Last couple of times I've purchased plane tickets online. There's been I've had the opportunity to check a box to offset my carbon footprint. Is that something we're seeing? And I assume that would charge me an extra fee. I have not checked that box. Yeah. Is that something people are doing? Is that something you would encourage us to do? Where does that money, do you know anything about this and where that money goes?
Yeah, so if you've traveled recently on major airlines, you've probably noticed that they talk a lot about how they're making a commitment to protecting the environment. You know, I was noticing the last time I flew that the little drink napkins are saying like we're planting a tree for this napkin or everything. So, and when you also book flights online, along with that box, you can see like the adjusted carbon footprint per flight per passenger. So that's something you can look at. And if you're checking that box, I mean, I'm gonna be honest, a lot of it is more like marketing. They're not actually doing that much, but I think it's really good that they're doing some small things because, like I said before, that's what's gonna make the biggest difference. So I mean, it's not really that beneficial, but if you want to do it, it's great. And just like, also another little tip is that when they have like a lower number for the carbon footprint, that's going to be a newer plane, so it's a nicer plane, so that's like a nice little thing. Also, one more thing that I wanted to mention that I didn't really have time for in the presentation is that a super easy and fun, I'm a really big fan of packing and carry-ons, and it's a great way to cut down on your carbon footprint because if you have a smaller bag, it's going to take it's less weight on the plane, so it's going to take less CO2 to get the plane off the ground. So that's a super, super easy way. It's also a lot more convenient as a traveler. So small steps like that, it's just what we need to do to help the planet.
So, go ahead. Sorry. So hotels give you an option when you check in. Do you want to leave your towel on the floor? That means that we will wash it, but if you hang it up, then do you think that should be even an optional policy? What do you think hotels can be doing to mandate some of this as opposed to giving it option to travelers?
Yeah, I think it's awesome what they're doing. A lot of people like to go to hotels because they like the luxury of it, they like the fresh towels, they like the fresh sheets, so that's like a big aspect of traveling, I think. But, like having people reuse their towels I recently stayed at a hotel where they only wash your sheets every 3 days unless you request otherwise. So maybe, like you said, leaving out the opportunity to request otherwise is definitely a way to cut back. If you're staying in hotels, especially in more like eco-conscious areas, a lot of them are taking steps like that. They provide you with a reusable water bottle to use throughout your trip, so you can fill it up in the tap, like anything like that. I think just it's more about encouragement, because people will be upset. A lot of people are kind of against, like, even though it's not a big deal, they are like resistant to these steps. So as long as you're like making it really easy for them to be more eco-conscious, that's probably the best approach.
So kind of building on this idea of sustainability, I'm curious if you found in your research anything that represents sort of the industry professionals' stance on the importance of sustainable travel, and if there's kind of a movement sort of growing among travel agents,
Yeah, there's absolutely a movement towards that. So I had two mentors. One of them is a sustainability professor, but the other one's actually a Portugal-based travel agent with a commitment. She has a blog. She's really, really committed to sustainability and travel. And I think that's becoming a really popular movement throughout the industry, both with like travel agents, flight attendants, hotel staff. People are really trying to, because they want to preserve their industry, they want it to continue, and so it is in their best interest, and they also care about the planet, of course. So yeah, I think that's definitely happening.
First of all, wonderful job presenting. You did great. I was wondering if during your research, did you find anything? I know it was very different when the Spanish flu of 1918, but I didn't know if there was like any other sort of pandemics or epidemics that happened, and if there was a boom after that with travel.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't focus too much on like the history of tourism. So, and also like tourism hasn't been as big as it has been for very long. It's only the past 50 or so years. But one thing that did cause a big boom was the 2008 recession. After that, there was a really, really significant travel boom. So, I mean, it's not the same thing, but it's along the same lines.
And the Leave No Trace, I love that you've added that in. Do you know that they have a free course that you can take?
Yeah, and it's...
Have you done that yet?
No.
I think you should.
Yeah,
and then
I definitely should.
And then I think that you should present to each of the divisions during an assembly, and I would love to help you with that, because they have little hand signals for each one of the 7 things.
I would love to do that.
And I think that would be a great way for you to like continue this on, because I think so many people at the school do travel, and like you said, because you travel, because you're a tourist, doesn't make you a bad person.
Exactly.
It's just there's things that you can do that I think a lot of people don't know about. And I just have one final comment that I thought was very interesting, just looking from the beginning of your paper to the end. I just found it very interesting and just somewhat ironic and maybe disturbing too, that initially when humans started traveling, it was because the climate was changing. And now, because humans are traveling, that is leading to climate change.
Absolutely.
And I was just like, oh.
Yeah. And I just, on the Leave No Trace thing, I would love to do that. Also, Florida doesn't do this as much, but some like states, in Colorado especially, in their schools, they learn a lot about Leave No Trace because it's so like outdoorsy there, and I think it's a really great thing that every state should focus on. So.
Which governments have you found that have the strongest regulation on tourist industries?
A lot of European countries like Sweden and Norway, they're really committed to protecting the environment, and those are great options for visiting. Also, I was talking about the Nepalese government, because you can climb Mount Everest from the Nepal side, but you can also climb it from the Tibet side. And the reason why so many people climb it from the Nepal side is because they're a lot more relaxed. They let way more people climb it. Tibet has actually taken a pretty strong stance to commit to protecting the mountain. So they're doing a really great job with that also.
Did you do any research on resorts or like all-inclusive resorts? And in my first thought, I would think they're making a very negative impact on the environment and the local cultures, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, so that's actually interesting because it's more all-inclusive are more harmful in terms of like local people that live in the area, but they're a lot less harmful in terms of the environment. And it's, if you want to have less of an environmental impact, a good rule of thumb is to go to one place for longer instead of like spending a period of time traveling all around to a bunch of different destinations. So it's more beneficial in terms of like environmentally, but it's also more harmful for like the local people. Yes.
As a person with no Instagram, is it really wrong to travel to impress friends if that makes you happy?
No, absolutely not. Like that's a really big thing that I wanted to focus on, is that the tourists aren't bad people because they're making these mistakes. They just don't know. And also, like, us as individuals, we're not responsible for the climate crisis. It's like the really big corporations that are dumping into the oceans and polluting so much, and it's their job to self-regulate. It's also the job of the governments to regulate them. But if we're choosing to travel and we're choosing to engage in society, we also need to accept some responsibility to take steps. And I think if you want to travel to post it on social media, it's not a bad thing, but it's definitely notable that that's the motivation behind so many people traveling. And I think like a really big thing that I was focused on throughout my paper is mindfulness, that you want to be mindful about the destinations you're choosing, why you're choosing to travel. And I don't know if, you know, to post on social media is the best reason, but if that's what makes you happy, then that's what makes you happy.
One comment, on one of the Corona slides you have a reference at the bottom. It doesn't actually have a title, so I don't know what that reference.
This one?
Yeah, like.
Oh, it's not like the source, it's just the link to the picture. Yeah.
So best to put like a title if it's not
Okay.
evident. Like from this one.
Here?
Or this one. Like here, I can kind of tell from the URL.
Oh, okay.
But
Okay.
You know, this topic is taken right out of AP Human Geography. This is a discussion topic in AP Human Geography. Tourism, the pros and cons, is a double-edged sword, especially in the developed world. That, you know, a lot of developing countries rely on tourism as a percentage of their GDP. And so when COVID hit, they took significant hits in terms of what they were able to do. But it does, and one of the things that we talk about, not just besides the environmental consequences of hotels and resorts and hundreds of thousands of people making their way into destinations, and what that does to the local environment in terms of sewage and what's having to be produced. Obviously, for locals, it is a source of income, but it does also create a bifurcated culture. And there's a sense that, you know, the more developed people who travel to less developed people, developed parts of the world, expect to see things the way they imagine they would look. They expect people to dress a certain way, and people are required then to put on what are really these faux shows, fake cultures, to make themselves give the image that, you know, this is what we do, when in fact it's not. And it also locks sometimes people into this sort of stereotype, and it's a really difficult dilemma. You know, having traveled a lot in my life, particularly more recently in Southeast Asia, there's thousands and hundreds of thousands of people who go to Southeast Asia, and you know, a lot of backpackers used to go to Southeast Asia, and some people have this idea that backpackers somehow are more environmentally sensitive than the more wealthy traveler. But in fact, for some countries, they are a nuisance rather than a help to their economy. They don't spend money, and the whole raison d'etre for tourism is we want you to spend money to help. That's why we want you. You know, we're happy to have our culture and be left alone. We need you. Bhutan has maintained a very careful control of the number of people they allow in that country. They only allow, I think, 25,000 people to enter the country each year, and you have to fly in their airlines through their mountain pass to get into a certain airport. You're not allowed to bring in any credit cards. They have very strict rules about how you conduct yourselves while you're in that country, hoping that they won't be contaminated by what they consider to be, again, turning themselves into a theme park.
It's like
that's
daily charge of $150
Huh?
There's like a daily charge of
The way they charge
$150.
or yes. And so, you know, to me, they are, you know, really attempting not only to preserve their environment, but to try to protect their culture from the contamination of constantly being bombarded by people. And once, you know, again, we can lament, you know, we go back to the 19th century and talk about the wealthy, how they would make their tour. Tourism was the purview of the wealthy. Now you know, the middle class people can travel, and it's expanded to a larger part of the populations. Chinese are traveling extensively. Every group of people has been satirized in terms of their behavior as tourists. It used to be the ugly American, but now there's all sorts of commentary on the Chinese tourist. The reality is, again, I think that as governments try to struggle with the idea that we need people for, you know, this is what keeps us going. How do we maintain our authenticity? Because people expect us to look a certain way, behave a certain way, and do a certain thing.
Yeah.
And then you have that bifurcation I'm talking about in terms of the people who can afford to go to those countries versus the people who live in those countries, who, by the way, are never given visas to travel to your country. So there's the people who are coming into the country. Those people cannot turn around and get on a plane and go to your country. They're not allowed to get a visa. And to me, that is a inequity that really is bothersome in my experience of traveling as a world traveler. And I don't know how we get around that, in all honesty.
Yeah, I really like that you brought this up. Two things. One, I like this point that you made about the theme parks, like avoiding turning into theme parks. I actually, a few days ago, got back from Japan for 2 weeks, and one thing that I noticed was really popular, especially in Kyoto, was this sort of business that people are running where they outfit tourists in kimonos for a day, and they all walk around in their kimonos. And one of my tour guides was really, really trying to get me to dress up in it, and she was like, oh yeah, like you have to do it, you look so good, like it's great. And honestly, I felt really uncomfortable. I didn't want to do it. I felt like it was kind of like a weird cultural appropriation thing, and I made this parallel between Disney's Bibbidi Bobbidi Boutique and this, because they're going into here, they're like getting their outfit, they're getting their hair done, their makeup done, and they're walking around all day, and I don't know, I just thought it was really interesting that was such a big thing, and I personally felt uncomfortable with it, but I can also see the appeal. And then one more thing, I talked a little bit about, I didn't want to get too into this because it's a really, really complex topic, but tourism, especially like luxury tourism, and how people are talking about that in neocolonialism. So I mentioned that in my paper. And I think this is like a really, really significant issue. I didn't want to get too much into it because, like I said, it's a really complex topic, but that's definitely a topic of debate. Yeah. So.
You mentioned Norway being one of the best in terms of sustainable travel, which I totally agree with. Did you observe, what did you believe was the most successful mechanism for reducing negative impacts, whether it be cultural, economic, or environmental? Did you find one or two that were most successful? Was it just reducing numbers, or did you find a certain mechanism to be best?
Yeah, it's like, so those countries that I mentioned, they are really, really strict about like people's environmental impact. They don't allow you to just like go out and leave they're just like really, they kind of keep an eye on tourists, and they control, I don't want to say control, but they're definitely like careful about what they're doing and what they're engaging in, and that's been really successful in helping their environment. And then also just like limiting flights and limiting, like I said, it's best to stay one place for a long time instead of moving around to a bunch of different countries and taking a lot of flights and trains and planes, So, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.